Hi, and welcome to the first chapter in the topic area of quantitative methods pertaining to your CFA curriculum. Now, the first chapter, which is about rates and return, is not only going to serve you as the building block for the rest of the chapters that is to follow after this, but they're also going to lay the foundation for the other topic areas as well. So, for example, derivatives and fixed income. Let me first browse through the learning outcome statements as contained in your curriculum. Interpret interest rates as required rates of return, discount rates, or opportunity cost, and and explain an interest rate as the sum of a real risk-free rate and premiums that compensate investors for bearing distinct types of risk. Calculate and interpret different approaches to return measurement over time and describe their appropriate uses. Compare the money-weighted and time-weighted rates of return and evaluate the performance of portfolios based on these measures. Calculate and interpret annualized return measures and continuously compounded returns and describe their appropriate uses. Calculate and interpret major return measures and describe their appropriate uses. Now, time is money, money is time. We are all aware of it. And it's no-brainer. Any school-going kid can tell you that at time t is equal to 0 today, that is, let's assume that this date being 1st of January 2030, if you have $1 million in your savings account, the same on 1st of January 2040, a decade down the line, is not going to hold the same worth. In other words, you would not be able to purchase the same goods of the specified quality for the same quantity by expending $1 million. That's not going to fetch you the same amount as it is fetching today. This is what is known as the time value of money. Now, there are various factors that are embedded into it, but one of the most relatable and logical factors that would be easy for us to digest is inflation. And as you would know, that inflation erodes the value of money regardless of the currency over a period of time. So $1 million today is not worth $1 million 10 years down the line or 20 years down the line. Now, what's the mathematics that wraps around this particular concept? You see, for this, I'm going to break this into a few mini concepts, first of which is something called as the compound interest rate. I could have taken you through the simple interest rate concept as well, but that's not going to serve the purpose. Let's assume that at a time t is equal to 0, you indeed have $1 million in your savings account, and your bank actually gives you 6% default rate of interest. Now, why I'm using the word 6% default rate of interest is because banks normally, mostly, at least in the developed nations, they're heavily regulated, and default is really not something that we can actually conceive of. That is to say, in other words, that serves as a good proxy for what a risk-free rate of interest would be. So at the end of first year, this $1 million is going to become $1.06 million. Now, what it is going to be 2 years down the line. Now, 2 years down the line, this would become 1.1236 million. How is it so? Because the initial principal, which was $1 million today at time t is equal to 0, yields you the future value of 1.06 million at time t is equal to 1. But this future value of 1.06 million then serves as the new principal for one more year. And thus, 6% as interest earning instrument on 1.06 million principal will effectively yield you $1.236 million at the end of 2 years. However, since we say that this is a default risk-free interest-bearing security, in other words, it's safe to assume logically that $1 million today is exactly $1.06 million a year down the line is exactly equal to $1.236 million down the line, right? This is exactly a founding block or founding stone of what a time value of money is all about and how the value actually changes. Now, mind you that if we could extend this, we could in fact extend this to infinity as well. But that's not the point out here. Interest rate, as you would have learned in your school days as well, first starts with something called a simple interest rate, and it is very easy to calculate. There is a formula given to it as PRT by 100, where P serves as the principal, R the interest rate, and T is the time horizon. So, instance, if you had put this same $1 million into, let's say, a savings account which exists in a simple interest manner, that means it is not going to compound on a yearly basis. So this $1 million is going to yield you 60,000 US dollar at the rate of 6% each year, right? So for year number one, it would be 60,000. For year number two, it is going to be another 60,000, so on and so forth, which means a decade down the line, you're going to get $1.6 million as part of the total cash flow. Now, mind you, this is based on the simple interest rate calculation, right? You could follow through one of the examples that is being given. So 1 million, instead of 1 million, I have considered 100,000 US dollar. And instead of 6%, I have considered 10% rate of interest. And instead of n number of years, I've just considered 1 year. So obviously you see that for 1 year, it is going to yield me $10,000 interest. So which means that if we extend this for n number of years, we are going to get n into multiple of $10,000. Okay. Now, this concept is a simple interest rate concept. It per se does not take into account the time value of money. The compound interest, on the other hand, changes this same principle by making it new principle for each succeeding year. So that's the basic difference. You see, I could have actually thrown you some formula as well and would have asked you that simply try and memorize them, but that's not the objective. That's not the intention. The intention is first to build the intuitive blocks. And the intuitive blocks is that interest rates can be broadly classified into two. One is known as the simple interest rate, and another is what is known as the compound interest rate. The compound interest rate protects the real value of money, whereas the simple interest rate does not guarantee the protection of the real value of money. Precisely the reason that when you park your money in savings account, you insist from your lender or from your bank, not lender, but from your bank, to put it into a compounding interest bearing account, because along with the interest, it also takes care of the principal, and thus it prevents the erosion of the value of the money itself. All right. So how the equation looks like? Again, there are expressions that are being provided. I leave it to you to understand or memorize the formula, but memorization is something that I never encourage and I practically hate, because I firmly believe that if you understand the underlying concept, if it is deeply embedded, and if you have actually decoded it, there is no need to memorize any formula. And since you do not need to memorize any formula, there is seldom any there is seldom any possibility that you would forget them. Let me graphically represent to you that how the compound interest rate actually plays, right? So let's take up, I'm going to take up 3 periods. You could take up any period for your choice. So let's say we are talking about 3 years in succession. And as before, I'm going to put in $100 out here. And our rate of interest remains fixed, that is 6% flat rate of interest compounded over 3 years. So, but natural that at the end of the first year, this 100 would now have become 106. How? Simple. The initial value of the principal being 100 plus the interest earned being 6%. So this becomes 6. Now, mind you, for the first year, and this is an exception only, for the first year, the yield from the compound interest rate as well as the simple interest rate, they are going to be absolutely identical. There is not going to be a penny's difference. But look how things change after this. Now, when we come to the year number 2, of course, what would have happened is that now you have got a new base or a new principal. This, when compounded at the rate of 6% for one more year, that would mean that you have 106 multiplied by 1 plus 6%, which will yield you 1.1236. Now, if you expand this a little bit more, it seems like, I'm talking about this one, it seems like it is equivalent to 100 into 1 plus 6% into 1 plus 6%. Is it not? Because if you do the same math, it is going to actually yield you 1.1236. In other words, this is my principal, 100. If I compound it for 2 period, this can be expressed as 1 plus r, or 1 plus 6% out here, to the power 2, because it is compounded for 2 period. All right. Now, what happens at the end of year 3? Of course, you have guessed it right, that now this one the new principal for year number 3 becomes 1.1236. Now 1.1236 is going to be compounded for one more year at the rate of 6%. So the final yield that includes the principal and the interest will now become 1.1910. Right? So these were all the factors that was there. So 106 multiplied by 1 plus 6% becomes 112.36, and this 1.1236, of course, the principal remains 100. Let's not forget the base principal, the principal at time t is equal to 0, which is going to yield you 119.10, right? In other words, 112.36, if it is compounded for one more year at the rate of 6%, is going to yield you 119.10. This could be equivalently written as 100, which was the base principal at time t is equal to 0, into 1 plus 6%, which is the flat rate of interest, to the power 3. If you generalize this for n number of years, of course, you're going to end up with this particular equation, wherein the final yield, which is being shown as A, sometimes it can be shown as FV as well. FV is future value or final value. In this context, you could use any of the terms. So the FV, or the future value, can be represented as PV, or the principal value or the present value, into 1 plus the rate of interest, flat rate of interest, to the power n, where n is the number of compounding periods. All right. The question out here is that if we could have derived the future value for each of this period in this manner, where the value of n can take up right from 1, you could put 0 as well, because if you put 0, then FV and PV will become same. 1, 2, up to infinity, any number it can pick up, right? So this also tells us that from this, for a given FV, for example, let's say the FV is 119.10. Okay. So for a given FV, we can also find out the present value or the principal value at time t is equal to 0, isn't it? Because it simply is an algebraic transposition. How is it so? Well, it's simple, isn't it? If we say that 100 into 1 plus 6% to the power 3 is equal to 119.10, this is equivalent of saying that 100 is equal to 119.10 divided by 1 plus 6% to the power 3. All right. So now we have got two outcomes from this. One is that in an interest-bearing security, given the rate of interest, given the time period, given the type of interest that we are talking about, we can always find out the future value or the final value or the final yield, right? And if we are being provided with the final yield, the rate of interest, and the time factors, of course, from there, we can find out the principal value or the present value. Now, when you go from the present value to future value, let me do one thing. because this is representation wise, this is better. So yeah. So we're going to term this as PV because time moves from left to right, assuming. So when we move from the present value to the future value in this manner, using the rate of interest as R, we call this process as compounding, right? And if we reverse the process, that means from the given future value or finite value, if we are to find out the present value or the principal value, we're going to call that R as discounting. Now, hold on. I am already aware that what confusion this begets. So you would think that if R remains the same, then what is the problem or what is the novelty by naming them once compounding when we move from left to right and then naming it discounting when we move from right to left? Well, the answer to that remains into one specific distinction is, and that is, so far we were talking about safe interest bearing instrument. In real world, it always may not be the case, right? We have risky securities in the market. The risky securities, for example, if you're talking about, let's say, a bond is also going to pay you periodic interest. More often than not, we call those periodic interest as coupon. It is in principle the same interest rate that the bank actually gives you at the rate of 6% we just discussed. It's one and the same thing. Okay, in principle at least. However, when there is risk that is attached to a security, which means now we are talking about an investment scenario, an investment instrument that is something other than considered deemed to be safe. In that case, the compounding and the discounting rate may not be same. Compounding and the discounting rate may not be same. And if they are not same, then of course we will have to identify them separately. So for instance, if, for example, if let's say the attached, we are talking about a risky security in which, let's say, it pays at the rate of 10% in the market. Let's say we're talking about a bond. You would have heard of bond. That bond is now priced at triple B plus. This is rated at triple B plus. And it is bearing a coupon of, let's say, 10%, effectively giving us 10% interest in each of the intervening periods. Of course, at the end of the period, we're going to get something known as the face value as well. However, by the rating that we have got here, the market perceives the riskiness to be more than 10%, or it perceives the riskiness to be less than 10%, or it perceives the riskiness to be exactly equivalent to 10%. That means it is taking the risk as it is. It is giving me the same worth as it is if we were to put in our investment into a bank. Of course, and albeit the rate would differ. But think from this angle as well. If this were so, that means the market's perceived yield and the market perceived riskiness, if they are supposed to be same, in that case, people will be less drawn to put their money into a safe interest bearing instrument that bears less amount of interest than this particular bond. Think about it, right? So in that case, you would definitely, because if you're sure that the worth of this particular bond that we are just discussing is exactly equivalent to the risk that it's bearing, and which kind of risk is there? Well, there are various series that's there. The prominent of one of which is the risk of default. That means that the one who has who from whom you have purchased the bond, the issuer of the bond, if the issuer of the bond does not live up to its promised coupon payment. That's where the issuer would actually default, said to have defaulted. So default risk is obviously the greatest risk in any interest-bearing security. So if the market perceives that no, the bond is absolutely fine, in that case, the bond in fact will not be rated at triple B plus. It would be given the highest rating of triple A, as it would be with any safe interest-bearing security in the market. So in that case, the riskiness and the yield of the bond, they're both same. And if that were the case, of course, you would know that no sane investor, no rational investor is going to put the money in the bank. But that is in practice not the case. Which could be the other two scenarios. Now, if we think of these two scenarios, the scenario number 2 is again a very, very improbable thing to have happened. Why? Because if the riskiness, if it is less than uh, the yield that it is actually producing in the market, so that means the security is much more worth than what it should be in the market, isn't it? Which means that people would not only be putting their money in this particular security, which is bearing 10% coupon, but it is also being perceived to be safer than that of the bank. In that case, of course, the discounting rate, the discounting rate would also be proportionately less than the compounding rate. And at this particular point in time, the security is much more valuable than that of the bank itself, which would mean that many investors are going to now chase the security, which would mean that the value of this security will be perceived to be even greater than that of the bank in the given sovereign. So again, this is seldom the case. Not that it cannot happen, but that is not central to our studying out here. Now let's focus to the most probable scenario, and typically why that bond is now rated at triple B plus. Remember, any bond can have the maximum rating capped at triple A, which is the rating of the country or the rating of the safest instrument in that particular sovereign, right? So you cannot have a rating higher than that. It is already capped there. Now, in this scenario, since the rating is inferior to triple A and is capped at triple B plus, or it is bearing a rating of triple B plus, it indirectly also conveys to us that the riskiness or the perceived riskiness, that is the most appropriate term, the perceived riskiness, and let me put it out here, the perceived riskiness of this particular security is greater than what it is actually bearing as part of its interest. And if that happens, then your numerator or the denominator, numerator in terms of compounding and denominator in terms of discounting, they're going to differ. We are going to talk about this a little later on. And since we are at the first chapter itself, let me also put a piece of advice to all of you. It's highly recommended to watch through the videos on the use of your BA2 plus calculator. I have had a detailed session being done on the use of the BA2 plus and BA2 plus professional calculator, that is Texas Instruments, because in there, all the functions of the calculator are being explained in addition to some very relevant and some very pertinent problems being solved. So all these questions of discounting, compounding will become much more clearer. But you should just know one thing, that if we were to calculate the future value, you see how the present value is being compounded. Okay. And if we were to calculate the present value from the given future value, you see how the rate is being discounted. When you discount, so the rate of interest sits in the denominator. When you compound, the rate of interest sits in the numerator. And except for the safest interest-bearing security in the given sovereign, that more often than not, which is basically the government-issued bonds, sovereign bonds, or that of the bank serving as a proxy, the discounting and the compounding rates are seldom the same. All right. So cash flow additivity principle. Now, a fundamental thing about finance is that if I were to invest into a given security, what is the worth of the security today? Of course, this has also got to do with something called as the fair value of the security. What does that mean? So think of it once again. Let's say you invest in a security which gives you $1,000, wherein you invest $1,000 in this particular security, and it pays you at the rate of 6% for the next 5 years. And at the end of 5 years, you're going to recoup, let's say, your principal, your amount as well. But this time, the amount that you're going to actually get from the issuer of this security may be equal to 1,000, may not be equal to 1,000. Why is it so? Is not again central out here as far as our curriculum is concerned. I'm going to explain this thing in detail when we study the fixed income security. But let's just first map the cash flows for the next 5 years. All right. So in this particular case, we are going to assume that this 6% rate of interest is going to be paid uh, annually, and this payment is going to be fixed each year. So it is equivalent to your simple interest rate. So that means if I had to map the cash flows, so from time t is equal to 0 till time t is equal to 5, I'm going to map it out. 1, 2, 3, 4. So in each of this period, I will be entitled to receive 60. And at the end of year 5, I'm going to receive 1,000. Remember, I had paid 1,000 out here. Okay. Now, if I were to ask you that what is the worth of this security, because you're going to receive 1,000 at the end of 5 years, the value of which is obviously, as I said before, that in a simple interest rate calculation, the real value is not preserved. But let's just assume that you're going to get 1,000 at the end of 5 years here. And each year, you're going to get this 60 as part of your periodic cash flow, more often than not, which is known as the coupon. Right? Now, if I have to ask you, what is the worth of this security today? You would say, well, I've just paid 1,000, so that should be the worth of the security. Well, when we talk about the worth of the security, we are in specific talking about something known as the intrinsic value of that particular security. The intrinsic value of a particular security need not always coincide with the market value of the security. Okay. The intrinsic value can be sometimes likened to something called as the fair value of the security, which is obviously an unbiased value of the security itself. But there is no guarantee that it would always be also equal to the market value, which means that the securities might be mispriced, they might be overpriced at times, and in other times they could be underpriced as well. But how do we find out what is the worth of that security? Because we are out here to find out the worth of the security. Worth of the security is basically the intrinsic value of the security. So, but obviously, you would know that we would need to now know all the cash flows first. But that's not the be all and end all of it. We also need a proper discounting factor in order to arrive at the present value of each of these cash flows. So in other words, we need to discount this 60 because this is what your cash outflow has been. 1,000 has been cash outflow. Now let us see what are the cash inflows. If we map the cash inflows here, so we need to discount this present value of this security for the first period and the second period. I hope that I need not actually tell you that where this R is coming from. R is basically the discounting factor out here. Okay. The 6% that you're earning is your periodic cash flows. R is the discounting factor out here. And the third period, obviously, it is going to be 1 plus R whole to the power 3. The fourth period is going to be 1 plus R whole to the power 4. And the fifth period is going to be 1 plus R whole to the power 5. Plus, you're going to get 1000 as part of your face value. We call this the face value, R to the power 5, right? These are the cash flows. If you add all of this cash flow, this is where we are going to term them as the present value of all cash flows, right? Because these are the cash inflows. Sometimes that is being represented by this large sigma. Okay. All right. Now, without even getting into the mathematics, let us assume one of the three scenarios, because only one of these three scenarios is possible. And we are now talking about R out here. Either the value of R is equal to 6%, or the value of R is going to be less than 6%. Let's assume that this less than 6% is 4%. It's an arbitrary number that I just made up. Okay. Or the value of R is more than 6%. Okay. Let's just again assume that that happens to be 10%. Okay. Now, what we would be doing is we can make use of our TI-BA2 plus calculator and see the worth of this security under each of these scenario. Under each of this scenario. Why is it so? Well, if we do this, then only we can compare the initial $1,000 that we have actually paid for this investment and what it is going to yield in a present value manner. Then only we can compare, because as we have stated before that the time value of money is important out here. We cannot compare $1,000 being paid today with the yield that I'm getting 3 years down the line, 2 years down the line, or even a year down the line. We need to suitably discount those future cash flows into present value format before comparing. And in this case, because this investment process lasts for the entire 5 years, we will have to club all the cash flows periodically, systematically, after discounting them suitably with the given discount factor, then club them up and then compare. Right? So we can, what I would suggest is that we can make use of our calculator, and I'm going to take you to I can take you to the Excel sheet to begin with. We can solve this problem in the Excel sheet itself. No big deal. All right. So we're going to plot 0, then 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. These are the 5 years cash flow, right? And the cash outflow, let me, I hope this is visible. So this has been cash outflow at time t is equal to 0, right? So I'm going to write this as cash outflow. And we have a cash inflow as well, which happens to be 60. And this continues up to here. And then we are also going to get the something known as face value or final value. The final value, as I said, because it is supposed to return the amount that you have paid, right? So this becomes 1000. All right. So now we have to calculate the present value of this cash flows, right? All right. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to assume at different rates. Okay. So the present value of this 60, because this is, we have to consider this first cash flows, cash inflows, right? So now I'm going to discount this. I'm going to discount this by 1 plus a discount rate. Now I do not know the discount rate. So I'm going to put this as R to the power 1. Oops. Okay. This is my 60, right? Of course, you can understand that this can continue for all the 5 periods. And finally, we can write the last cash inflows that we are going to receive as part of our. All right. So this is how it is, right? Now, if we sum all of them, then that is where we can compare them, because now all of these cash flows have been suitably discounted to the year 0 itself, which is known as the present value. Now your Excel provides a lot many elegant tools to do this. This was just a visual depiction that how it is going to work. So instead, now I can use the Excel formula. So I'm going to write this as PV, that means present value. And I'm going to now take the rate of interest first, which is the R. So let's experiment. We're going to put the R. We're going to assume 3 scenarios as we have discussed. So first, we're going to assume the R to be 6%. Another, we're going to assume scenario number 2, we're going to assume the R as 4%. And the last scenario, we're going to assume the R as 10%. And now we're going to solve this, right? So I'm going to write PV. Let's pick up the rate of first rate of interest, that is 6%. How many periods we're talking about? 5 periods. What is the payment that we are getting? That is 60. And since it is common for all, we can simply write 60. Any 60, we can write 60 numerically or choose any of the values, any of the cells out here. And the future value, of course, is going to be 1000. Let's rewrite. Of course, this is end of period 0. All right. So you see, this becomes 1000, exactly equivalent to what you had actually invested at time t is equal to 0. Why is it so? Because in this case, the compounding rate was 6% and the discounting rate was 6%. When the compounding and the discounting rate are 6% each, that means they're same. At that particular point in time, your future cash outflows and the present value of all the cash flows, they will always be equal, identical, right? Now let's just change this. You could ignore the minus sign. Okay. So in this case, what we're going to do, write this as G17, choose this one, and this we're going to lock at N9. You can lock this if you want. There you go. Okay. In this case, the discounting rate is less than the compounding rate, right? Which means that the numerator is yielding at 6% and we are discounting it at 4%. The denominator is less than that of the numerator. When that is the case, the worth of this investment is always going to be greater than whatever we have paid in the beginning of the value. In this case, otherwise, what we say that the intrinsic value is positive. In the first case, the intrinsic value is 0 because what you are getting as part of your yield, and you could ignore the minus sign out here, and what you're getting as part of your yield and what you invested, they were identical in the first case, where the discounting rate and the compounding rate both were 6% each. In the second case, where the discounting rate was 4%, the yield is more because the denominator to discount them is obviously going to be less. Remember the discounting formula. How do we do it? Each of this cash flow that we get, we discount, right? So the numerator is all about the principal amount into 1 plus the compounding rate, right? And the denominator is all about 1 plus the discounting rate. So if it is a common sense, if the compounding rate is more, if the compounding rate is more than the discounting rate, that means the numerator is always this factor, this particular factor is always going to be greater than 1, right? When this happens, of course, the end value obviously is going to be greater than what you had invested initially. If these are same, then this obviously this factor is going to be 1. In that case, the total worth of the investment is always going to be 0. The intrinsic worth of the investment is always going to be 0. Let's move to the third scenario where the rate of interest is 10% for discounting. Now you see what has happened, that the discounting rate, the compounding rate remains 6%, but the discounting rate is 10%, which is more than the compounding rate. When this happens, the worth of the investment is obviously going to be less than what you had invested, which means that the intrinsic value is in the negative. Okay, so I hope this is a very important learning, and I want you to practice it yourself as well. As simplistically I have done it out here, but do not forget how powerful the concept out here is, because this is also not, this is not only going to be helpful for your quants curriculum, but also it is going to lay the foundation for your fixed income as well. So in other words, the compounding rate and discounting rate, they are to be first and foremost treated separately with any interest bearing security. Since our chapter is all about rate and returns, so obviously rate and returns are part of your interest rate as well. So of course we need to distinguish between the two, and there could be scenarios where the compounding rate is equal to the discounting rate. In that case, the worth of the investment is always going to be 0. In cases where the compounding rate is more than the discounting rate, the worth of the investment is going to be positive. And when the compounding rate is less than that of the discounting rate, the worth of the investment is going to be negative. How is it so? Well, it is simple. You are invested, you can compare this, you are invested 1,000 and you have got 1,000 out here. For brevity's sake, I can proceed this with the a negative sign. Okay, and this would, I think, solve the purpose. All right. So in the first place, you had invested 1,000 and you have got 1,000. So if we simply add these two, you can get a 0. In the second case, your value is positive 89. And in the third case, your value is negative. Okay, so this is what is being told out here. This is a very powerful concept, and I want all of you to redo this problem yourself so that the concept is well cemented. All right. Now that we have got a good bit of a hang about cash flow additivity principle, discounting rate, compounding rate, worth of investment, intrinsic value, etc., let's move to the interest rate comparison as well. Now, this again, it's better that we solve these kind of problems through the use of our calculator. But before that, as always, I'm going to build the intuition first. And this is what is known as the effective interest rate, or EAR, effective annualized rate. Sometimes it is known as effective interest rate. Sometimes it is called as the effective or equivalent annual rate. They're one and the same thing. All right. So what does it actually convey? Let's assume that we are talking about two separate investments. Okay. And these two separate investments, they pay me periodic interest rates, but one pays quarterly periodic interest rates and another pay half yearly interest rates. Let's say the one that pays interest rate quarterly pays at the rate of, let's say, 10%. It's not 10% per quarter, but it is 10% annualized. Always do remember, unless otherwise specified, interest rate or any rate that you see with a percentage, they are always specified on an annualized basis. So do not forget this. This must be well cemented and well etched in your mind, unless otherwise specified. So whenever it is being stated that there is an interest-bearing security that yields a 10% quarterly compounded, that means that it is going to give you 10% divided by 4 each of these quarter. Okay. Similarly, we have got another security which is paying me 10%, 10.5%, 10.5% on a semi-annual basis. Okay, on a semi-annual basis. So you could understand that we are in the first case, in the first type of investments, we are talking about an interest-bearing security that pays at the rate of 10% every quarter. And in the second case, we're talking about a 10.5% security that pays every 6 months. Now, if I have to ask you that which one is, you have, let's say, $10,000 or $100,000 to invest. And if I have to ask you that you could choose only one of them, which one would you choose? Given all other things remain constant, which one of it is you're going to choose? It's a question mark, right? Why? Because you already have intuitively understood that we cannot directly compare these two securities. Just because 10.5% seems better, we also must not forget that the 10% security pays much sooner than that of the 10.5%. We have to wait for 6 months before even we could get the first cash flow, right? Even we could get the first cash flow of 5.25%, whereas we can get the first cash flow of 2.5% within 3 months itself, and another 2.5% in another 3 months, right? And of course, it's no-brainer that money received earlier will be definitely worth more, all other things remaining constant, than money received at a later period. Somebody giving you $100 within 2 months is more valuable than somebody giving you $100 6 months down the line. It's a no-brainer, right? So it's the same kind of problem that we are faced with. Even though the interest bearing in these two securities are different, we cannot directly compare because the periodicity differs. Now, if we have to solve this problem, then we will have to take the help of or lean on the concept of the equivalent annual rate or the effective interest rate. Now, in your BA2 plus calculator, it provides you an elegant shortcut, and I'm going to teach you that it is going to take you less than 15 seconds to work through this problem. But even before we could actually get through this, let's understand the way to work them out. Okay. So the way to work them out is that you must understand that if somebody pays you at the rate of 10% quarterly compounded, the word out here is quarterly compounded, not simple interest. That means we could compound this for all the 4 quarters and arrive at a particular value, right? Now, what if I told you that there could be an existing security in the market, or an effective annualized interest rate can actually be found out, which would bear the same interest without any quarterly compounding, but only annual compounding. What exactly am I talking about? So all that I'm saying is that you are going to get certain cash flows out here every quarter given. And at the end of the last quarter, obviously, you're going to get your principal as well. And obviously, that's going to mean something to you much more valuable because you're getting a sizable portion of your promised cash flow much sooner than what anybody else would get if they were to wait for 6 months or one full year. But can we find out the equivalent rate that would yield me the same amount, the same value without any compounding, but at the end of 1 year itself? Of course, the answer to that should be simple. How do we do it? Well, that should be simple, isn't it? All that I'm saying is that if I, let's say, invest 100 and I'm getting at the rate of R%, but R obviously quarterly compounded. So how many quarters are there? So there are 4 quarters. So this is equivalent to investing 100, but into a security that is going to bear me capital R without any compounding, right? So if this value is being given, if the R value out here is given, that which in our case happens to be 10% for the quarterly compounded, definitely from here we can find out the value of the capital R, isn't it? Right? We can do this. Yes, I'm sure logically you would understand that that's possible. That also means that now we can extend the same concept with the second security as well. If we could do it with the first security, which was bearing quarterly interest, we could do the same with a security that bears half yearly interest. Am I right? So that cash flows would look, those cash flows going to look something like this, right? So in this case, this should be the I'm going to name this as R2, right? So from here, I can definitely find out R2. Now, since both of this is now equivalently compounded for one full year without any sub periods, that would mean that now R1 and R2s are comparable. Now R1s and R2s are definitely comparable, right? So if we extend the same logic, that would mean that through this process, we can then take a decision that which investment is worthwhile, which interest is going to bear me more money, all other things remaining constant. And the process is actually through finding out their equivalent annual rate or equivalent interest rate, right? Now, this I think that intuitively is clear to you. Now, the question out here is that how do we effect this in our calculator? That's the question. And that's pretty easy. How do we do it? Well, we could do a couple of things. Let's take the example out here of 10% quarterly compounded. Let's find out their equivalent annualized rate. So in this case, what is required in your and strictly this is for TI BA2 plus calculator. I would not know how it is being solved in the Hewlett-Packard C12 calculator. That is also one of the approved calculators for your CFA exam. But since majority of the students actually use the TI BA2 plus calculator, hence I'm going to teach you through that. So all that you need to do is to open your calculator, press the button second, and then press the button 2. Now, overshadowing the button 2, there is a legend known as ICON. ICON stands for interest rate conversion. So the moment you press the button 2, after pressing the button second, your calculator is going to, worksheet is going to show something called as NOM is equal to 0. Now, I want you to get familiarized with the worksheet first. Once you see this, press the down key button. press the down key button, and you're going to get a value of EEF is equal to 0. EEF happens to be the effective annualized rate, the same EAR that we were talking about. Press the down key again, and you're going to see a value called as C by Y is equal to either 1 or 2, depending upon your calculator setting. 1 or 2 will be there. The C by Y stands for the compounding period. Only by playing around these three, feeding in the correct value, keying in the correct value, we can, given the two values, we can find out the third one. It is as simple as that. So let's just try it out. Let's take up the first interest rate bearing security that is quarterly compounded at the rate of 10%. So all that we are going to do is press second, press 2, and then we come to NOM. In NOM, once you come to NOM, I want you to press 10 and then press the button enter. Press 10 and then press the button enter. So that means you have fed your worksheet with the 10% quarterly interest rate. And then press the down key. Ignore the EF. The EF will be showing you by default 0. Press the down key again, and depending upon how your calculator is being set, it would show you either 1 or 2, as I've stated. Once you come to C by Y, I want you to press the button 4. Press the button 4 and then again enter. Once you have done this, you could press the up key once. Press the up key once, and you will be seeing the EF worksheet, that is the effective interest rate worksheet. And now I want you to press the button CPT. Once you see the button CPT, press the button CPT. Okay. Once you press the button CPT, your calculator is going to show you a value of 10.38. Okay. What this 10.38% means? Remember, we discussed those R1 and R2 interest rate. R1 for the quarterly compounded interest rate. This was your R1, right? The equivalent interest rate for quarterly compounded, right? So this is your quarterly compounded interest rate of 10.38%. That means it conveys us that investing in a security which is yielding 10% quarterly is equivalent to investing in a security without any compounding sub periods, but compounding only for a year. That rate is going to be 10.38%. So 10% quarterly compounded is equal to 10.38% annual compounded. That's all that it means. In other words, R1 happens to be 10.38. But our job is not yet over. We need to redo the same exercise with R2 as well. So how do we do it? Well, again, we are going to resort to the same worksheet. And this time around, I'm going to pace up, but I'm going to still suggest you, because your worksheet will already be populated with the previous data, you need to clear the memory of the worksheet. In order to do so, please press the button second, CEC. So your calculator will now be going into the default mode, and again you will be seeing the NOM value as 0. Okay, and as before, I want you to feed in the value of 10.5 out here. Press the down key. Ignore the EF button for the time being. The EF is going to show you 0. And press the down key again. And out here, the C by Y will be fed with 4. So I just want you to press the button 2 and press the button enter. Press 2 and press enter. Once you have done that, you could press the up key once. Just press the up key once so that you default to the effective interest rate worksheet, and press the button CPT. Press the button CPT. Once you press the button CPT, your calculator is going to throw you a value of 10.77%. What does 10.77% tell us? It tells us that investing into an interest-bearing security that yields me 10.5% semi-annual pay coupon is equivalent to investing into a security without any compounding sub-periods, but being compounded only once a year at the rate of 10.77%. Now that both have been annualized, we can now compare R1 and R2, and from this exercise, we can see for ourselves that the instrument number 2 is, of course, more lucrative because it yields me more interest rate than security number 1. The security number 1 yields me at the rate of 10.38%, whereas the security number 2 yields me 10.77%. So obviously, all other things remaining constant, the investment number 2 is preferable to investment number 1. So certain worksheets for your ER is being given. For example, 11% monthly compounded. What would be the periodic rate? What would be the number of periods? What is the effective interest rate? There are some formulas being mentioned in your textbook, and more often than not, the formulas are, this is the basic, the formula, the effective interest rate formula, wherein it is being stated that EAR is equal to 1 plus R by M in to the power M into 1 minus 1. Okay, but excuse me, but as before, I would not recommend anybody to go into the memorization path. That's not suggested. What's suggested is to familiarize yourself with the calculator that you're going to use, because in any case, even if you resort to this formula, you will still have to key in those values in your calculator. So a much more elegant and simpler way presents in your calculator itself. So you could see out here 11% monthly, quarterly, semi-annual, annual compounding is being given. Of course, the last one is very easy. I'll fill it up for you. For 11% annual compounding, there is only one period. Periodic rate is, the periodic rate is obviously going to be 11% only, because it is 11% divided by 1. And number of compounding periods is obviously going to be 1. And of course, the effective annualized rate is also going to remain at 11% only. In case of semi-annual period, the periodic rate is going to be obviously 5.5%, because 11% divided by 5.5 divided by 2 becomes 5.5%. There are 2 compounding periods. The effective annualized, how to find that out? Well, you could use, again, as I said before, you could make use of your calculator, which I prefer. Use the interest rate conversion sheet, press 11% in the norm, and I'm just dictating now. I hope that you will be able to do it yourself. Press the second button, press the icon button, and now you're going to get the worksheet. The first and foremost thing that you need to do is to clear the memory of the worksheet itself. Once you've cleared the memory, then key in the value. The nominal interest rate remains 11%. Press the down key once. You will going to come to the EF page. Press the down key once again, and now the entire work resides with the C by Y, the compounding periods. As we alter the compounding periods, the effective value will change, and it is going to take less than a couple of seconds to do the math. Okay, instead of again working through the formulas out here, it's much simpler to make use of your calculator, right? So I'm going to do it for each one of them. So in the first page, semi-annual, so I'm going to put the C by Y. This is C by Y at 2, right? So I'm going to feed in the C by Y as per 2. Press the up key once, come to the effective, and press the CPT button. It gives me 11.3%. 11.3%. Now I have to go from semi-annual to quarterly compounding. All that I need to do is to press the down key again. And in this down key, the C by Y now becomes, 4, because there are 4 compounding periods, right? So in these 4 compounding periods, I will simply change the value from 2 to 4, key in the value, press the up key button again, and press the CPT button. And it gives me a value of 11.46 effective annual rate. 11.46 effective annual rate. So from quarterly, I need to go to monthly. What I need to do, there are 12 there are monthly compounding would mean there are 12 compounding periods. So the effective annualized interest rate in this case, you will have to change the C by Y from 4 to 12. C by Y now becomes 12. So press the button 12, key in the value 12, press the up button once, and then press the effective interest rate. So effective interest rate 11.57%. So you see that through practice is going to take you less than 2 seconds to do this job, which otherwise manual calculation is going to take much more value. I want you to remember all of these values. Starts with 11.57%, 11.46% to 11.3% to 11%. Okay, and let's see whether the answers are correct or not. Yes, the answers are absolutely correct. But what's more important is for you to visualize that what's going on. So if this is the annual compounding, right? This is the semi-annual compounding. This is the quarterly. And then if we have to default to the monthly, so of course you can understand that there are going to be 12 subperiods, isn't it? There are going to be 12 subperiods out here. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 12 subperiods. Okay. So you can understand how the compounding happens in each of this period. So one logical question that might be rankling your mind is, what is the extent of compounding that we can think of? So naturally, a monthly compounding can also be further exploded to daily compounding, right? Even that can be done. As we have seen that increasing the all other things remaining constant, increasing the compounding period enhances the effective interest rate. Yes, it does, from 11% to 11.572%. So if we increase this to 365, that means that we're going to get a huge value, isn't it? Well, not so. You could use your calculator once again, and instead of C by Y being 12, we could put C by Y as 365 to reflect the daily compounding, and the calculator is going to yield you the result of 11.62%. Why? There is only incremental value increase as far as the interest rate is concerned. Why the interest rate is enhanced only by incremental amount? Well, think of it. As you go on increasing the compounding period, the periodic interest rate also reduces proportionately. So the annual interest rate, obviously, it is going to be the highest. But as you go from annual compounding to semi-annual to quarterly to monthly, further to daily, of course, the periodic interest rate will reduce drastically. So 1 plus a very small amount to the power, whatever it happens, obviously, you can understand that it is, and this is in percentage, so which means it's going to be 1.0 something, whatever, 1 point something, right? It is in percentage. So that is obviously not going to make a huge difference. Now, all of these things that we have discussed so far, these all pertain to something called as the discrete compounding. From discrete compounding, there is also known as the continuous compounding. Visually, you can liken this to, let's say, we have discussed what semi-annual compounding. A continuous compounding is going to look something like this. That means there is going to be infinite period, right? There are going to be infinite period. But if there's infinite period, of course, you can understand that the rate of interest on this infinite period is also going to be infinitesimally small. So one thing is logically correct, regardless of the type of interest rate regime that we are talking about, whether it's discrete compounding or continuous compounding, simply by enhancing or increasing the number of periods is not going to guarantee that the rate of interest is going to differ drastically from one regime to another regime or one compounding frequency to another compounding frequency. Okay. And when it comes to the continuous compounding, you could read through the text. I'm not going to bother about this, but just to tell you that, we use the exponential power out here. Of course, we have to use the exponential power because the denominator out here is infinity. If we use infinity, this practically defaults to 0. And of course, 1 plus 0 is equal to 1. So 1 to the power infinity is always going to be 1. But that's not going to be solving our problem in a continuous manner, compounded. So we have an elegant way of representing that, wherein we said the future value is equal to the present value into e to the power r into t. This is how the yield should be if we're dealing in a continuous compounding regime. Okay. There is a sum that is already being worked out here, wherein you have invested $100,000 at the rate of 7%, but it is being continuously compounded. You can visually understand that how the continuous compounding would look in contrast to a discrete compounding. So you could, all that is required is to key in the value, and you'd see that they yield you 107251. Now, as before, how to do this in our calculator? Is there an elegant way of solving this problem in our calculator? And the answer to that is yes, there is. But stay tuned for part 2 of the presentation, wherein I'm going to walk you through the other aspects of the rates and return and much more interesting examples. See you soon. Stay tuned.